Hey guys, Jen here, up with another dose of fresh hell. What I wanted to talk about today, because I saw somebody make a comment on Blue Sky about how, um, hey, this sandwich at the restaurant that used to be $8 is now 15. When are they going to lower prices? And the answer is they're not. And I feel like that there's a good percentage of the American public that does not understand how inflation works. And I'm not throwing shade here. I don't want to bash on anybody because honestly, if you're younger than my age, and I'm not going to tell you what that age is, but you can tell from the color of my hair that it's not young. Um, if you're younger than people my age, you probably never had any experience with inflation as a teenager or adult. Um, because we didn't have any significant inflation from like the mid 80s up through uh, the pandemic. So that's a period of what, 35 years? So if you were growing up during that time or coming of age and were a young adult and then a middle aged adult, you never had any experience with inflation. Those of us who became teenagers back in the 70s and then young adults during the 80s, we had a lot of experience with it because it was really high then. And just let me tell you, whenever a certain someone goes on ranting about the highest inflation in history under Joe Biden, that's a lie. It's not true. Inflation was much higher during the 1970s and during the 1980s. We even had like a 1 year bump in inflation. I think it was in 1990. um, I don't remember that, so it was must have been it was short term. It is not something that went on for years, and that's probably why it didn't impress itself on my memory. So it's not your fault if you don't know how inflation works. And I also blame a lot of members of the Democratic Party or Democratic elected officials for continuing this narrative of prices not coming down because they don't come down after inflation. That's not how it works. I understand that they're probably saying that because they're wanting to point to it as a broken campaign promise when Trump campaigned and said, I'll get prices down on day one. uh, I was listening to it saying, well, big boy, how are you going to do that? Because that's not how it works. And so understand what happens with inflation is you have a period where there's something that went on, like maybe there's an oil supply shock. That's what happened in the 1970s, or at least part of it. Or you have something else that suddenly starts driving prices up. And of course, with energy, that's going to drive prices up across the board because you have to have energy to produce your goods. You have to have energy to move them to market. And then that ripples through the whole economy. Because if your supplier is charging you more and it's costing them more to move the goods to you, somebody's got to make that up. Um, Typically, the only things that ever come down in price, you may have a situation where people are gouging. That's happened with some of the grocery items I've noticed. You can have the situation like I talked about with an oil price shock, where you end up getting more supply back on the market and then the price goes down. Or you may have something that is new tech. So, like flat screen TVs, when they first came out, they were very expensive. Now they're cheap. And it's just that thing about getting the amount of market share and the amount of production that it becomes cheaper to produce them, and so they go down in price. But that's not how it works for most things. Once inflation increases the cost of, say, plywood, it doesn't come back down once the inflation comes down. All that means is it's not going up in price as fast as it was during the inflationary period. And if you think about something like housing, you can see very easily inflation is something that's pretty much always going on, unless you're in a recession. Inflation is always going on. You always kind of want low inflation to be going on around the 2% or lower mark, because what that means is you have a healthy economy. You have a good balance between uh, money supply and goods. Because inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. That's why you had it during the pandemic with those supply chain disruptions, because there were things that people were trying to get. I had to buy tires for my car at the end of 2020, and tires were a little bit hard to find. If you need a specific tire, you had to do a little bit of calling around to find somebody who had it. And so when you've got something in short supply, the price goes up. And so that's why we had the inflation after COVID. And if you look back at housing prices through the decades, you can see quite clearly that inflation is a normal part of life, right? Because the house I'm sitting in right now sold new for, I think, $3,400 in 1941, and it's valued at something like 100 times that now. And the only way that you get that happening, regardless of overinflation in the housing market at the current time or whatever, um, even when I bought it 30 years ago, it was 61,000. So you're looking at year over year prices and the value of money going down, the prices of goods going up, and that's normal. Um, so it doesn't go back down. And the reason why this matters is because, number one, uh, you shouldn't be disappointed when prices don't go down. If that's your expectation, you're going to be disappointed. Inflation sets a new baseline, and prices don't go back down after an inflationary period. But the second and more important reason that you need to know how it works is when everybody's running around talking about lowering prices, they're missing the ball, because they're not going to go down. And what we need to be arguing for is raising wages. That's the way that people get back affordability after an inflationary period. And I have a sneaking suspicion that maybe one of the reasons even some of the Democrats are not talking about it that way is because they don't want us to be yammering about raise wages. But that's what needs to happen. So the whole conversation needs to be changed from let's get these prices under control, let's get them down, which isn't going to happen, to let's get these wages up, because that's what it's going to take to get things back to equilibrium where people can afford to live again. So keep that in mind. Um, so, it's kind of important to know this stuff so that your expectations are in line with reality, and also so that we can protest, argue, push for the thing that it's going to take to really get us back to a place where people can afford to live. The other thing I would note is that uh, when you have an inflationary period like we went through right when during COVID and right after it, it does take a few years for all of the price increases to roll through the economy. And you may have noticed this because, early on we saw that grocery prices were going up and prices for building materials and things of that nature. And those were going up because of supply chain issues and uh, labor disruptions and that kind of thing. Then we got to the end of the pandemic, and when everybody started using gasoline again, before all of the production had come back online, that sent gas prices through the roof. And then that got added on to the cost of everything else because it's part of the cost of everything else. But then what you saw a couple of years within a couple of years following that is then we had insurance rates go through the roof. And if you think about it, it makes total sense because you're 1 or 2 years into that inflationary period when the building materials are going up. Think about those people that had a hailstorm and had to have a roof replaced, or had a tornado came through that, or a hurricane that blew up their house. Now the cost to rebuild that is significantly higher because of the inflation, and the claims that the insurance company is paying out, they're also significantly higher. And so they have to go back and recalculate about, what premiums are going to be in order to cover um, the property that they've insured. So it is something that just reaches into every part of your life. But demanding prices to go down, wrong approach. That's not going to happen. And we really ought to start calling out everybody who talks like they can make that happen. I I understand why the Democrats keep talking about that, because it was a campaign promise that Trump made that obviously he has not honored. But we can talk about that all we want to. It's not going to help anybody afford their lives. What's going to be required for that is for wages to go up. So concentrate on that instead. All right, that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching. We'll hopefully see you again soon. If you enjoy any of the content that I'm creating, please give me a like, share, um, comment, whatever. Do all the things. And I do appreciate you watching. Thanks. Bye.